I just feel like it's a very community-driven conference. It also has a lot of quality, and people are just nice. Hi, my name is Sarah, and this is Asian Conf in Dornbirn.
Amazing venue. Austria is beautiful. Meeting all of the people in the community and getting to go and hang out and ski.
Thank you, thank you. Hey, like she said, I'm Max Stoiber. I'm from Vienna, so I just took the train here, which is super nice. I'm always super excited to go to AsianConf and that I get to go skiing and talk about tech at the same time. It's probably the best conference on the planet, I think. I'm at MXSTBR pretty much anywhere on the internet. The handle looks kind of complicated, but it's just my name without any vowels. I'm here today to talk about CSS-in-JS. Now, CSS-in-JS, I first want to cover how it works, what it is, and then I want to go over why we use it and sort of the evolution that we've had so far. CSS-in-JS in general looks something like this. You write your CSS in JavaScript. In this case, this is using the styled components library, which is the one that I created, but really almost any CSS-in-JS library will look kind of like this. What we have here is we define a title component. This title is a React component that renders an h1 HTML tag. That's why we say styled.h1. Essentially, our title React component is a styled h1 tag. And it will be styled with whatever styles we pass into the tag template literal. So in this case, our title will have a color of pale violet red and a font size of 24 pixels. We can then use this component like any other React component that you're used to. Now, under the hood, we actually go ahead and we create a very unique class name for you. We hash the styles that you pass into the tag template literal and create a class name that is completely unique. So what this looks like in the browser, and look closely because it's going to be a short animation, is that we inject some CSS, in this case, a .sc dash some random hash class name. And then we actually render an h1 in the HTML with that class name applied. Now, all right, that's why would you ever do this? Why does this make any sense at all? Why not just write CSS like you're used to? For me personally, there's 5 big reasons why I like CSS-in-JS. And the biggest one is the confidence it gives me. Because every piece of styling is co-located with the component that it styles, I can add, change, and delete CSS without any unintended consequences. I don't need to worry about any other component, any other part of my app when I'm editing the styling of a certain component. This leads to really painless maintenance. When I'm working on a component, when I'm working on my title component, I don't have to go grep around my code base to figure out where exactly that class name is that is overriding the styles of my title component. I don't even have to go look around for other things that could be affecting the title component because all of the styles that affect my title component are right there next to the component. Another big thing that's huge for maintenance is that CSS-in-JS gets rid of the append-only style sheet. If you've ever worked in a big app with Sass or less or just vanilla CSS, eventually you usually end up with an append-only style sheet where you're kind of scared to change anything that was sort of written before and you only add stuff to it. I know I've experienced this multiple times, but with CSS-in-JS, that cannot happen. Because if I stop using a component and I delete the component, all of its CSS is automatically deleted as well, which means I never end up with any dead CSS in my app at all. That is huge for teamwork, right? When I work in a team, I might know CSS really well, and you might know CSS really well, but not everybody in your team will know CSS super well. They won't be an expert with many years of experience in how to architect your CSS files, how to keep them maintainable, and how to avoid the append-only style sheet manually. With CSS-in-JS, everybody gets this huge confidence boost of just being able to work on their component and not having to worry about anything else. Of course, it doesn't mean you can't write bad CSS. You can still write bad CSS, but at least it's contained to a single component, and you can then clean that up later. It won't affect anything else in your entire application. Now, another big thing about CSS-in-JS is that it has fast performance. Now, this might sound kind of weird, right? With CSS-in-JS, you're essentially adding a middle step. You first have to evaluate the JavaScript, and then we have to inject the CSS, the library has to inject the CSS before it'll be rendered. However, this happens synchronously, and it's super fast. It's even faster when you use server-side rendering, because with CSS-in-JS, we can keep track of which components you actually use on a page. If you do not use the title component, we will not inject the CSS of the title component. That means when you're server-side rendering your app, you will only ever send down the styles of the components that are actually used on the specific page that is currently being rendered. Nothing more and nothing less. It's automatic critical CSS built into the library. You can't even do it any other way. That's just the way it works. As far as client-side rendering goes, if you don't do server-side rendering, in many cases, CSS-in-JS will still be as fast as CSS files. The reason for that is that you avoid an extra network request. If your users have to download a CSS file, you have to do an extra network request. You have to load an extra file. With CSS-in-JS, that's just included in the JavaScript bundle, and then we inject it. And the injection is so fast that it's pretty much the same time as it would take to do another network request and load the CSS file anyway. And the fifth point why CSS-in-JS is super nice is dynamic styling. CSS-in-JS makes it super easy to do complex dynamic styling, complex themes, and adjusting your entire application based on some global themes that are defined. And that doesn't just include primitive values, it includes entire rule sets that you can just switch out at will whenever you want. The big thing about CSS-in-JS is that it guides you to the pit of success. It guides you towards doing the right thing. Of course, it's not perfect. You can still mess up. I still write bad CSS every now and then, right? I'm not the best developer on the planet. But with CSS-in-JS, me and my entire team are sort of guided in the right direction, right? We're sort of guided in the right way that we're not going to mess up some common problems that occur with CSS. Now, whenever I talk about the benefits of CSS-in-JS, people come to me afterwards and they say, yeah, but I'm an expert with 15 years of experience in CSS, and I have a perfect process in my team, and it just works perfectly for us, and why would I ever use this? And the thing is, if your CSS is fine, you probably don't have to use CSS-in-JS. Just keep doing what you're doing. That's awesome. However, CSS-in-JS combines all of these benefits into one thing, right? It sort of enforces you to avoid common mistakes with CSS. And it does that all in one handy package. Of course, you can achieve all of these things manually. You could do all of this manually in your own app with good processes, a well-trained team, and some very amazing tooling. But with CSS-in-JS, you don't even have to think about it anymore. You just avoid all of that work and do it automatically, which is huge. So that's a little bit on how CSS-in-JS works and why I personally like using it. Now, I want to talk a little bit about where we're at. CSS-in-JS has kind of taken over the React world. Last I checked, a couple weeks ago, 60% of React NPM installs also installed a CSS-in-JS library. That's huge, right? We're talking about 60% of all React apps. And the thing is, it's not the 60% where people are just writing testing apps, right? Big companies like Reddit, Patreon, GitHub, New York Times, and many others are using CSS in production to power their most important apps because it just makes them move faster and it makes them avoid bugs that they usually have. So how do we get here? How do we get to 60% of React apps using CSS-in-JS? It all kind of started in November of 2014. Two big things happened there. The first was that Oleg from Berlin published the very first CSS-in-JS library ever called JSS. And JSS really introduced this notion of actually writing and composing your CSS in JavaScript. And in fact, JSS was way ahead of its time. A lot of the more newer CSS-in-JS libraries nowadays still rediscover and keep rediscovering some of the techniques that he used back in November of 2014, which is incredible. The second big thing that happened in November of 2014 was that Ed Vigeux from the React team gave a talk at a tiny conference in Washington, D.C. called Nation.js. And he spoke about how at Facebook they use CSS-in-JS to keep their app more maintainable. That kicked off a huge shitstorm. The entire internet exploded. and essentially flame-warmed him for being a complete idiot and what the hell they're doing at Facebook. Now, this talk was, and it still is, extremely popular. If you've ever heard of CSS-in-JS, you've probably seen a screenshot of his slides. His slide deck has been seen more than 600,000 times last I looked, which is quite a while ago, so it might be well over 1 million by now. Lots and lots of people looked at this talk, and sort of it really kicked off this whole era of experimentation and new ideas that we entered after that. The first thing that happened was that in January of 2015, Formidable Labs published Radium, the second CSS-in-JS library. Now, Radium tried something interesting. They tried to make CSS-in-JS work by assigning the CSS to the style attribute. Now, if you've ever used inline styles, you know that this isn't quite ideal, because with inline styles, you can't have many things that you can with CSS. You can't have media queries. You can't have pseudo-selectors, pseudo-elements. Lots of those things don't work. And so they tried to hack around it with Radium by doing it with JavaScript. For example, for media queries, they would listen to window resize events and check whether the window width was smaller or larger than the media query. Nowadays, 5 years later, pretty much to the day, we know that this wasn't the best approach and that there are others that are better. But it was an important stepping stone for others to learn from and then go further. In February of 2015, Brent Jackson published the first version of Rebase. Rebase is a library that really introduced this CSS components API. So he introduced this box component. And you would just use this box component throughout your app, and you could provide props like color or background color or font size or font family. And you would style your app really via React component props. Now, Rebase is still going super strong. It's now on the 5th version, which was recently published. I personally use Rebase in almost all of my apps. It's super great nowadays. In May of 2015, another big thing happened. Now, CSS Modules isn't technically CSS-in-JS. With CSS Modules, you still have CSS files at the end. However, what CSS Modules really did was that it popularized outputting unique class names. So it popularized this notion of, oh, I'm writing one class name, but actually what I see in the browser is completely different and completely unique, so I don't have to worry about giving it a unique name. That was huge, and it's something that, again, is still a benefit of CSS-in-JS and CSS Modules today. CSS Modules, again, still going strong, still awesome, still used by many people. Highly recommend using it if you're into it. Then a couple months later, in September of 2015, we got CS.js. This is a tiny library that not many people know of and that I wouldn't recommend using today because it's deprecated. But CS.js was really the first library that allowed you to write actual CSS in your JavaScript. Before CS.js, all of these CSS-in-JS libraries, they would let you write your CSS as JavaScript objects. Now, that has benefits and drawbacks, right? It's a trade-off. Your designers might not know how JavaScript works, and so they wouldn't be able to edit the CSS, which might be a huge downside in your team. And so CS.js was the first library to make it possible to write actual CSS like how you're used to in strings in JavaScript. In October of 2015, Khan Academy then released their own CSS-in-JS library called Aphrodite. And Aphrodite really focused hard on performance. And what they did, and what they were the first ones to do, was that they output atomic class names. So you would write CSS like how you used to. You would just say color blue, padding 4 pixels, whatever you put in your CSS. And then they would create a unique class for every single CSS rule that you specify. And for many applications, this actually leads to a smaller total CSS size because you don't have that many unique CSS rules. They're also huge on the critical CSS extraction. What I talked about earlier, only injecting the CSS that is actually used. Aphrodite was the first library to ever do that, and it really showed that with CSS-in-JS, you could actually achieve better performance than if you were to write vanilla CSS files. Half a year later, in June of 2016, Robin Frischmann from Berlin then released Fella. And Fella took this notion, if you've ever read any React tutorial, you might have heard of this thing called your view is a function of the state. That's what React does, right? It handles your state, and then based on that state, you can render a certain view. And with Fella, they sort of took that concept and they made it work for styles too. So suddenly your styles were also a function of state and could be changed anytime the state changed. Again, Fella is super awesome. Robin is a good friend of mine and is super great. And Fella is still being used by tons of companies nowadays and is still awesome and still being developed. A month later, Sunil Pai, who now works on the React team, released Glamour. And With Glamour, he focused even more on performance. And what he found was this somewhat obscure browser API called CSS-stylesheet.insertRule. And with CSS-stylesheet.insertRule, you essentially bypass the DOM entirely and inject CSS directly into the CSS object model, which is a thing in browsers that I didn't even know existed at that point. Now, compared to doing it via the DOM and just creating a style tag and setting it in a text, this is much, much, much faster, like 10,000 times faster. And with this sort of, by popularizing this, it really cemented CSS-in-JS as a super fast option for writing your CSS. Before that, there were always kind of these performance drawbacks that you would have. Now, I gotta give a huge shout out here to JSS, which was the first library published 2.5 years before Glamour. The very first version of JSS that Oleg wrote already used CSS-stylesheet.insertRule. It just took every other CSS-in-JS library 2.5 years to catch up to him, which is absolutely incredible. Now, Glamour nowadays has been deprecated, and Sunil recommends using other libraries, but it was, again, an important stepping stone in this evolution. A couple months later, in October of 2016, we then got two things. The first was that the site team announced JSX style. Sorry, this is not the site team. This was Pete Hunt, who used to be on the React team from the Smite team. That's it. And JSX style really took this CSS components API concept that Rebase introduced and took it even a step further. And they went even further and allowed you to style literally everything from React component props. Again, JSX style still awesome, still being used by tons of people everywhere around the world, still being maintained, super great. Also, in October, I stood on stage at React Netherlands, and I announced the release of styled components. What styled components really did was we introduced and popularized this brand new API, this styled.tag API. In the first case, in the first example that we had with the title component, it was styled.h1, right? But it could be any other HTML tag too. And at the time, we discovered it and we thought, this feels kind of nice to use. We'll see what people say. And it turns out people loved it. Styled components absolutely exploded and is nowadays the most widely used CSS-in-JS library. In December of 2016, 2 months later, Ryan Tsao, the guy who originally made CS.js, published Styletron. He works at Uber, and they had their own sort of app that they wanted to build for, and they needed their own CSS-in-JS solution, and so they built Styletron for their own use case. And Styletron took what Aphrodite initially did, which is outputting atomic classes, and they took it a step further and really spent a lot of time on optimizing everything to the most minimal set of classes possible. Again, Styletron, still used at Uber, still used at a ton of other companies, still awesome. Ryan's a great guy and super smart. Also in December, we got styled JSX, this time from the Zeit team for real. They sort of focused on really giving you and lowering the barrier to entry. What styled JSX gives you is this sort of style tag-like API. So you're literally writing a style tag in your React component code, and they will optimize and make your class names unique. So if you know how to write a style tag, you know how to use styled JSX. In fact, if you've used Next.js, it's from the same people, you've probably used styled JSX or at least seen it. Again, still awesome, still great. Styled JSX still used by tons of people everywhere, still being developed, still great. In March of 2017, we then got Astroturf. Now, Astroturf is really important. Astroturf essentially introduced the first CSS-in-JS library that allowed you to extract to a CSS file. Now, that might sound completely bonkers because of what I told you before, but it actually kind of makes sense. For some use cases where you have multiple apps or multiple websites that might or might not be using React, you can use Astroturf to still write your CSS in JavaScript and compose it in JavaScript, but then in the end, you get an actual CSS file with random class names in it. In April of 2017, Kenzie Dodds released Glamorous. He worked at PayPal at the time, and they wanted to create their own CSS-in-JS library. Now, Glamorous really popularized this idea of writing CSS as JavaScript objects. Again, trade-offs and trade-offs, right? Benefits and drawbacks, but they wanted to do that, and they also wanted to use this styled components like API, and so they built Glamorous, which is essentially styled components, but it lets you write CSS as JavaScript objects. Now, Glamorous nowadays has been deprecated in favor of styled components and Emotion because we now also support writing your CSS as JavaScript objects. But again, this really popularized this idea that, hey, maybe writing CSS as JavaScript objects isn't such a bad idea. In May of 2017, we then announced Styled Components v2. And the big important point about Styled Components v2 isn't actually styled components. It's about a thing called stylus. A guy named Thai Sultan down in Africa somewhere, I think in Tasmania, built a CSS parser in JavaScript. And not only did he build a CSS parser in JavaScript, he made it super tiny and super duper fast. And so with Styled Components version 2, we switched to using stylus, which essentially cut 90% of our bundle size down. Not only that, but it was much, much faster than what we were using before, which is post-CSS. Now, without stylus, a lot of this whole CSS-in-JS thing wouldn't be as popular as it is today because you'd still add huge amounts of bundle size to your apps. But because stylus is so tiny, it allows us to sort of really have small bundle sizes as well. Nowadays, practically every single CSS-in-JS library uses stylus as their CSS parser of choice. In July of 2017, Kai published Emotion. And what he really tried to do with Emotion is re-implement styled components, but much, much, much faster. And what Emotion really did is that it kicked off and still ongoing performance competition. Up to that point, everybody was sort of focused on, trying new APIs and coming up with new ideas and seeing what people think. But then Emotion came on board and everybody was like, wow, we really got to focus on performance. And literally every single CSS-in-JS library started focusing heavily on performance. And I mean bundle size performance, right? Like they're all optimizing their own JavaScript bundle by size and by performance. And if Emotion hadn't been published, we'd probably still be 10 to 100 times slower than we were at the time. Nowadays, all of the CSS-in-JS libraries are super fast. And that's mainly thanks to Emotion being like, hey, we can be super fast. Why aren't you? In September of 2017, we then got Linearia. And Linearia took what Astroturf did with the static CSS extraction and allowed you to do that with the Styled Components API. And Linearia, again, all of these libraries that I just talked about, they're still super popular, they're still being used, still being maintained. In November of 2018, we then got Emotion v10. And the point of Emotion v10 was that it really switched from prioritizing the Styled Components API to prioritizing the CSS prop API. So rather than statically defining your components, you're now passing a CSS prop to any div or span or h1 or any other HTML tag, and you can style your components that way, which actually works out super nicely in most cases. And then a couple months ago, in June of 2019, we got Theme UI. Brent Jackson and John Otender built something called Theme UI, which is essentially taking this CSS prop idea and takes it a step further by making your CSS be based on a theme and the scale by default. So rather than writing font size 2, you're now writing rather than writing font size 16 pixels, you're now writing font size 2, where 2 is a step on a scale, right? So the first step on a scale would be 8 pixels, the second step on a scale would be 16 pixels, etc., etc. And that really makes your whole app much more consistent because everything is based on the same scale, whether that's for like sizes and padding and margin, or it's for fonts, or it's for colors, right? Now, the thing is, when you just listen to me talking about all of these apps and all of these libraries, I love all of them. They're all great. They all brought something unique to the table. In fact, sometimes people try to paint the CSS-in-JS community as sort of people bitch fighting with each other all day long and being like, ha, you suck, no, you suck, no, you suck. But really, I'm constantly talking to all of these, right? They're all friends of mine. We're constantly sharing notes. We're constantly working together to make this whole ecosystem better. And that's the reason why it's evolved so quickly. It's just because we've all been working together to make all of this stuff better. Now, something else you might notice is that we had a huge burst of innovation in 2016 and then 2017. But then in 2018 and 2019, everything kind of slowed down, right? We're sort of at a low point right now where really we're getting one new idea a year, where we used to be getting 1 or 2 new every month. And that leads me to the future. I have no idea what the future of CSS-in-JS is. I have no idea what good ideas are out there that haven't been explored yet. But maybe you do, right? I want to encourage you to start experimenting. If you notice issues with how you write CSS, if you notice issues with how you use CSS-in-JS, right? Maybe you have an idea for an API that you want to implement. Maybe you have an idea on how people should be writing CSS in a better manner that gives them some benefits, right? explore it, try it, share it with the world, and see what people say, right? It might work, it might not work, but we need more innovation, right? We're at the local maximum right now, and we need to go further. Now, here's a couple generic tips to make this endeavor, if you do try to tackle it, more successful. This applies to any open source project, really, though. The most important one is that you should do it in this order. Make it work first, then make it right, then make it fast. That's what we did with style components. The first version of style components was absolutely horrible. What we did is we took PostCSS, which is a node-based CSS parser, we ripped out all of the node parts, and we ran it in the browser. That was absolutely insane. That is a huge bundle size hit that we took. But at the time, it didn't matter because nobody was using styled components anyway. We were just trying out this random new API idea that we had. We had no idea whether people would like it or not. If nobody had liked it, if it turned out that it wasn't a good idea, then there wouldn't have been any point in trying to optimize it further, right? We just needed to get the idea out. And then what we did after that is we made it right. We focused on nailing the core API to make everything possible. And then as the last step, we now worked on making it fast, right? Now, making it right and making it fast often happen in parallel, right? We're still changing around some APIs. We still have new ideas on how to make our APIs better. And simultaneously, we're also working on performance. We're also working on making these new APIs even faster. But in general, that is the right way to do things, especially if you try to innovate on a new idea. Make it work first, and then share it with the world. Then make it right, and then make it fast. That leads me to my second point. You should really share early and share often, right? The only reason styled components is the most popular CSS-in-JS library, and it is as good as it is, really, is because we talked with people. I went to conferences and I talked about styled components, and I was like, what do you think? Give me some feedback. And people gave me feedback, and they told me what a fucking idiot I am, right? And I was like, I listened to them. I listened to their problems, and I listened to what they were saying, and we made styled components better because of that. And then people started using styled components, and they gave us feedback. They said, hey, how do we do global styles? Why is this API kind of weird? This kind of sucks. I can't do this. And that's the reason that styled components got so good, is because we shared early, and we shared often. We talked with people. We went out there, and we showed what we had. And yeah, people came to me and told me what a fucking dickhead I am, right? All the time. I still hear that every second day. But it doesn't matter, because I like what I do, and many other people do too. And we made styled components better because of that. And the third and really important point is that you need to document all of the things. It doesn't matter if you create the best library on the planet. If there's no documentation for it, or the documentation sucks, it's never going to go anywhere. Nobody's going to use it, right? We spent a lot of time documenting everything about style components, documenting how you could use media queries, pseudo-selectors, documenting how you could do dynamic styling, documenting how you could pass props, documenting literally everything. Because that's the only way that people are going to keep using your library. If you don't write documentation, nobody's going to use it. So let me leave you with this. If you have any idea, if you want to try something, if you have problems that you're trying to solve or that you have solved internally, share your ideas with the world. Try to build a prototype and make it work, and then come talk to me. Tweet at me and I'll share it with the world, right? What do I have an audience for? I want to see new ideas. I want to see new APIs, new fresh things to do in our React apps. That's it. Thank you very much for having me.
Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask Max?
Please don't tell me that I'm an idiot.
He's not an idiot. I mean, we're all idiots.
That's right.
He's not any more of an idiot than, oh, there's a person up there, up there. Sorry.
Hi, Max. Thank you for your talk. One question or two. The first one, I'm missing the library from Material UI. I think it's called Styles, right?
Material UI?
Yeah.
Material UI uses JSS under the hood. The very first CSS-in-JS library.
Ah, okay. So the performance of this library is nowadays also super fast. Okay, that means it's also usable in competition to all of the currently used.
Yeah.
Solutions.
JSS is still awesome. Lots of people still use JSS like Material UI, right? Every single Material UI user uses JSS, and Oleg has spent the last 5 years making JSS super fast, super performant, and super great.
Okay. And the second one, and you're still using style components for your applications, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
No worries. I like how that was a
That would have
question.
been so weird.
Yeah.
Like, no.
No,
Fuck you, I use
actually,
emotion. They
I
won.
went back to vanilla CSS files.
Actually, the new Microsoft Edge, the one that comes with Chromium uses JSS.
Nice, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's
Oleg
awesome.
tweeted about it. Yeah.
Nice.
He's also still working on it. He's a friend of mine in Berlin, so it's still getting maintained.
Yeah.
Which is honestly one of the longest living, like probably
Open source projects.
Open source
Yeah,
projects.
for sure.
Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, 3. There we go. Oh, okay, didn't even have to go to 2. There's one over there.
Hi. We, in our company, we use style components as well. But I think somebody introduced something called styled system, where like people start using like CSS,
Like a components API,
like
right?
props,
Yeah.
the passing stuff. I found that like very hard to maintain, and then it felt like we're going back to like inline styles. Doesn't it like sometimes like this sort of like CSS in JS feels like a bit of like lack of separation of concerns? That was the very first reason people started using CSS style sheets.
That is a good question. Whenever I talk about CSS-in-JS, people come to me with separation of concerns. But the question is, which concerns are you separating? In a standard website, you're separating your HTML from your CSS from your JavaScript. But in a component-based system, that doesn't really make sense anymore. The concern that I have is my button component. And I want everything related to that button component to be in the same place, to be just affecting that one place. And then I have an accordion component, and I want everything affecting that accordion component to be in the same location and to only be affecting this. So my concern is no longer the technology stack. I'm not trying to separate by technology. I'm separating by component, which I find works out much nicer, right? Because that's really what I care about. Whether I write my CSS in JavaScript or not, right? I want my components to look the way they should look, right? So we're still separating concerns. They're just separated vertically rather than horizontally, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it makes it. I'll just talk about like what the difference between writing style components versus using props as.
Yeah, that's just a matter of taste, right? Whatever you like, the more, I'd say.
Anyone else? Okay, cool, Max, you're free to go.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well.